Hi, and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, managing editor of townhall.com, and today I am joined by.
Cathy Reisenwitz.
And who are you with, Cathy?
I am with sexandthestate.com. It is a news and politics blog focused on individual liberty.
Yeah, I wanted to have you on because I have to say Cathy's blog is one of the most interesting, I think, blogs out there today, focusing a lot on feminist issues, libertarianism, obviously things that are under the purview of government. And I wanted to start with how you kind of synthesize feminism and libertarianism, because one of the, I think, kind of standard arguments for minority groups being libertarians is that, libertarianism is presented as a philosophy of government and the law under which everyone is treated equally, and isn't, what minority rights and kind of identity politics pushing for is for everyone to be treated equally. But in general, that's not, you kind of come at it from a more traditionally feminist perspective, acknowledging, structural power issues that infect our society, but still kind of coming away saying that libertarianism is the best philosophy for feminists. So if you wanted to kind of run through that with me, I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the kind words on my blog. So I think that libertarianism has traditionally kind of been the antidote to this idea that we have. So the idea is there are structural impediments for certain groups to succeed, and everyone definitely succeeds better in a free market, but leaving it there and saying, okay, well, we just need to get government out of the way and that's going to solve everyone's problems, I think is just not quite good enough. I think it's been a huge part of the reason that free market ideas and libertarianism has not really appealed to anyone beyond straight white middle class men. And so I think that where people don't really come together is they think that, okay, if we acknowledge that there are structural impediments to success, if we acknowledge structural racism, if we acknowledge the sexism in gender roles, all of which are non-state and mostly voluntary, but still pernicious, then we have to allow for government solutions to those problems, or we have to look to the government to solve those problems. And I'm looking for ways to say, no, not necessarily. We can educate people, we can challenge the culture, we can change the culture in totally voluntary ways that are compatible with the free market and are actually more free market than a lot of what the left and right are proposing now, and still kind of address those inequalities.
But how do you come to that? I mean, a lot of minority politics writers write about how, the kind of the end of racism or the end of sexism is not even a fathomable concept right now.
Sure.
We're so far from a raceless or classless or genderless society that it's not really useful to even say, once we get there, then libertarianism will be feasible. But we're so far away that instituting kind of government solutions to these problems, we look on Capitol Hill, and the most probably relevant legislation recently is fair pay legislation, saying that,
Right.
Obviously structural sexism has caused fairly large discrepancies in pay between male and female employees, even for people doing the same general jobs at the same education levels, at the same stage of their life. Even correcting for all of that, we still get pay gaps, and that the only solution to that is going to be fair pay legislation. So, and
Right.
we're nowhere near solving that without government solutions. So why not go with things like fair pay legislation?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think from a free market perspective, the arguments against fair pay legislation are pretty compelling. I think regulating has unintended consequences. It can cause employers to discriminate against women. It can it definitely violates the rights of employers. So I definitely don't advocate for fair pay legislation, but also on the other side, you have the people who oppose fair pay legislation kind of saying, well, the wage gap isn't really a problem, because when you break it down and you show when women make the exact same choices as men, the wage gap is a few cents. And so, yeah, that's true. But to have that be the end of the conversation, I think is really problematic. It's really lazy and exclusionary, and it's not a winning strategy if we want to attract women to our movement. And so, what I have focused on is the free market solution to the wage gap as it is, the 77-cent wage gap that is 77 cents to a man's dollar that, the average woman experiences as a result of her own choices, is to look at what influences those choices. And so what I focus on is the gendered expectations, that women choose generally to work less intense jobs for fewer years. They work fewer hours in a week because they're expected to do so much more at home than men are. And so I think that that's maybe not a problem for every individual woman, but it's definitely an issue, not just for women who are then having to, if they want to succeed in a career, buck gendered expectations, which is hard to do and has negative consequences. If we have ideas of what's feminine and what's masculine, to eschew those definitely has some stigma attached to it. But it's also a problem. These gendered expectations are also a problem for the economy. I mean, especially as we transition from a manufacturing and agriculture-based economy into an information service-based economy, to which women are, it seems like, better suited and are definitely succeeding more. Young single women in cities, childless women in cities, are out earning their male counterparts. Women are getting more degrees than men. So to tell these women that they need to be at home kind of robs society of the value that they would add in these careers. And so it's anyone who believes in the power of innovation and free market should be concerned about gendered expectations.
Right, that's absolutely true. But I don't see where the solutions are coming in. Right, so obviously we need to be aware of gendered expectations. It's important to tell people to kind of take that into account as we're obviously educating young men and women, make sure that people aren't growing up with gendered expectations. But what do you do beyond just, telling people be aware of this? Because that's what I see as the advantage in kind of traditional left-leaning feminism, is that there are, I think that libertarians struggle with this in general, is that you come up with a government solution that's pretty easy and probably addresses the problem, at least in some way. But
No,
libertarianism
true.
has a harder time coming up with non-government solutions to some of these problems.
That's true. And for women, I think it's an extra big challenge. One thing that I think would really help women immediately would be abolishing the minimum wage and streamlining immigration. So if you have an influx of, low-wage labor, unskilled low-wage labor, that's going to really make it a lot easier for women to outsource those expectations that they have to deal with childcare and deal with running a household more easily, so that they don't. It's difficult to get started for a woman a lot of times because she needs to make a lot of money right out of the bat if she's a parent to ameliorate what it costs to put her kids in childcare and to keep up her house. And so if we lower that barrier to entry for women through those policy proposals, I think that would do a lot to help women right now who want to achieve in their careers. But, that's neither of those are a panacea, of course. And so that is a challenge, and it's a trade-off. You can have but there are no perfect solutions. I mean, even with gender wage pay gap legislation, you still have unintended consequences. It still isn't going to solve that underlying problem of gendered expectations either. So
Well,
good and bad solutions.
That seems to me to be an argument of working what you're proposing in with, fair pay legislation. Like, fair pay legislation doesn't address gendered expectations or a society where the norms are structured against women, but it also doesn't hinder that, you know? It seems to be saying that what you're saying and like a fair pay legislation or a lot of what the traditional feminist movement proposes can work in concert together, not necessarily against each other.
So then you would just have to argue, are the negative consequences of fair pay legislation worth whatever you would get? I mean, fair pay legislation should only close the gap for women who make the same choices as men. So that's it's a 7-cent gap. So is violating the rights of employers, is possibly causing a situation where women are, not hired as often, worth closing that 7-cent gap? And in my opinion, no. Others may feel otherwise.
Right. I think the frame of women making the right choices or the same choices as men, whatever frame you want to use, that comes up fairly often in kind of libertarian circles. And I wanted to get your perspective on that. It's kind of like libertarians I see making the argument that if all women were Sheryl Sandberg, if all women subscribed to the lean-in theory of, business success for women, then the things like fair pay legislation wouldn't be necessary. That gap would disappear. But to me, it seems like that places of undue burden on women, and that in and of itself acknowledges the structural issues at play, saying that there are different expectations that women are going to need to meet on an individual level to even catch up to men in the first place, right?
Right. One thing that's interesting to me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
Is in feminism, there's kind of a debate between choice feminism and kind of more traditional feminism. And I hope I'm not strawmanning either, because I'm not sure I completely understand them, but it seems like to me, there's a question of, is your choice to, for example, be a stripper or be a sex worker, if you think that is fundamentally, if that market is fundamentally demeaning to women or sets women back as a group, is it unfeminist to make that personal choice for yourself? Or is the choice to adhere to traditional gender roles setting women back? And I think that I definitely want a world in which it's acknowledged, first of all, that there are benefits to those individual women for making those kinds of choices, and that they absolutely need to be free to do so. Hewing to a traditional gender roles has its rewards, and a lot of women genuinely like it, and they don't have any need to be told otherwise or to contemplate otherwise. But for those women who don't want to adhere to those gender roles are pernicious. So, I think it's. Sorry,
it seems like if it's really hard in those cases, and obviously this is what it struggles with, but it's really hard to separate out who the women who make choices that reinforce traditional gender roles, if they're only making those choices because of the gendered expectations they've grown up with, or if in a society where there weren't any gendered expectations, would they make those same choices and still enjoy them as much as, they say in our current society? And it kind of is a difficult, I think, struggle to grant women the autonomy that we need to grant them, but also acknowledge the role that expectations are playing in those choices.
Well, and a lot of people try to straw man my position to say that I'm saying that women are robots who aren't really free to make choices. And that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that every choice each one of us makes is not made in a vacuum, that the culture and the expectations and the education that we receive influences our decision making. And so just as it influences a woman's decision making to hear that, she should be taking care of her kids and she needs to be on the front lines to pick them up from soccer practice, it influences a man's decision making to hear that he needs to be head of the household and he needs to make all this money. And so it's not either or, it's not black and white. It's not we're free to make choices or we are robots. It's that we're all influenced by the culture.
Right. That's one of the things that I think libertarianism's kind of as it's traditionally conceived of and discussed in its movement, that it struggles with, which is, they say, look here, what if, you have a woman who wants to conform to all the traditional gender norms and expectations that we have of her? What if you have that, is that woman kind of denying her power as a woman or whatever? And what they don't acknowledge is what you were talking about, which are the gendered expectations she grows up with. So they want to say, this woman might be fully aware of all of that and still make those choices. But structurally, we still have to acknowledge the pressures on her that have shaped who she is up to that point, that that decision is made.
And we certainly can't challenge them until we acknowledge them, until we're talking about them, until we're admitting, like, this is a thing. Gendered expectations exist, and they have utility, and they also have drawbacks.
Right. That you have to acknowledge them. At the very least, getting the libertarian movement to acknowledge that is important. So this kind of segues into another topic I wanted to talk about, which is, does the libertarian movement in general have a women problem? And there was a kind of blog discussion of this earlier this year where, you do polls, you do surveys, and the libertarian movement is almost uniformly male. Not uniformly, but I don't remember what the numbers
70%,
are.
70%, I think.
70-80% male, right? And you go into, why is that? Is that merely a coincidence, or is libertarianism in and of itself kind of appealing to what might be traditional, gender conforming expectations of people that are attracting more men to the movement than women? So in your opinion, does the libertarian movement have a women problem? And if so, what do they need to do to kind of fix that?
I mean, I think definitely the libertarian movement has a women problem. I think even more severely, free marketers have a single women problem. And I think that's because, and I've thought a lot about this, libertarianism doesn't have much to offer women specifically as women. And it doesn't have much to offer men specifically as men, but it just kind of works at the default positions on, okay, let's not so much challenge the current culture, the current distribution of wealth, the current accumulation of capital, but let's just make sure that it's distributed voluntarily going forward. I think appeals to people who have traditionally been the capital holders. But that isn't to say that there's nothing that libertarianism can offer women. I think libertarianism can offer women two huge things. First of all, I think it can take seriously those cultural problems that we talked about. It can be critical of gender roles and gendered expectations. And then I think the personal freedom aspect can be really appealing, especially to single women. Like one more free market than we have now suggestion that I have that I think libertarians need to really take up is, making birth control over the counter. That's absolutely, there's no medical reason for it to be prescription only. It's big government overreach to keep women away from, or to erect a barrier to entry for women to obtain their birth control. Another avenue that I think that libertarianism could take is to stand up for the rights of sex workers. And so that's something, not all sex workers are women, but it is kind of understood as a women's rights issue, and it's absolutely consistent with libertarian philosophy that you own yourself and you can do with yourself what you please, and that the state has absolutely no role in preventing women from using their bodies as they want to. And so I think, as more women get involved in libertarianism, then we're going to see more women thinking of ways that we can kind of beat back the state in order to help women.
I want to actually push back, or at least probe you on the sex work aspect. There's an argument that says that sex work in general is uniquely susceptible to abuse. And you look at what's been going on in Europe, they've had a fairly large problem with kind of the illegal sex trade playing into the legal sex industry. And in Amsterdam, they've been kind of cracking down on how it works, instituting more regulations. And some people have said that that's kind of proof that you can't have a quote-unquote legal, safe, and rare sex industry. That you need like the outlawing and the you know, making it a norm that sex work is taboo, is necessary to cracking down on some of these abuses that actually do happen to women in developing countries.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think one resource that I would point everyone to is Cato Unbound, just covered sex work. Recently, Maggie McNeil she writes at The Honest Courtesan. She's a former sex worker and current blogger, and she kind of talks about a lot of that. So I would highly recommend everybody go check that out. Maggie's awesome. Read her blog. So yeah, I mean, I think libertarians understand, and I think this is true, that there are, of course, problems with lots of industries, but prohibition doesn't work. And not only does prohibition not work, but it makes everything worse. And so, you have the issue with human trafficking and girls going into prostitution when they're underage, and those are huge problems. But the solution isn't to push everything further underground. That simply doesn't work, and it makes sex workers' lives a lot harder. The solution is to work with sex workers to find people who are actually coerced and who are actually underage and rescue them, because nobody knows who is coerced and who is underage, like a voluntary sex worker working in the trade. And so, that's why the UN Human Rights Commission came out with a report that said, if we want to fight, global human trafficking, we need to legalize sex work, bring it into the white market, regulate it, and we need NGOs and police officers working with instead of against sex workers to rescue people.
Well, what of the argument that even in, let's say, like an ideal sex industry, you're still going to have more abuse of a greater number of people than you would in an illegal sex industry?
So because, you're saying that legalizing it would cause the industry to grow?
I don't think, and there are a lot of issues. Like you said, the UN has a huge volume of literature actually on the illegal sex trade, the international illegal sex trade. But, it's really hard to actually find a functioning, safe, legal sex market anywhere in the world. So the idea that this might be an ideal that we'll never be able to reach, and that the better option is making it taboo, delegitimizing it, having it underground, and going after it that way instead.
I've never seen any evidence that that's ever worked, ever. And it doesn't work in any other instance, I don't think. I mean, it hasn't worked for drugs. It hasn't worked for guns. So, I guess possibly, but generally speaking, I think that that one of the biggest reasons that sex work is so dangerous is because sex workers do not enjoy property rights protection. In a lot of places, they are much more likely to be abused by police than helped. And so any situation where we can extend property rights protection, white market legitimate property rights protection to anyone, whether they're, trying to use drugs or trying to participate in the sex trade, is going to be a safer, healthier, better situation.
All right. And you think, so this kind of extending the property rights argument to sex workers, you think is something that will attract more women to the libertarian movement?
I think that, maybe not, but we need, as libertarians, something to offer. And just saying, less government, I don't think is enough. We need some kind of, we understand your issues, we care about women's rights, we understand that women are, autonomous people with agency, and that they deserve that kind of freedom and that kind of agency to do what they want, and we care about outcomes. We're more concerned about the actual effects of regulation more so than whether it's in a perfect world would prohibition against sex work. In a perfect world, would wage discrimination laws work? To take that idea of we're going to actually look at how things are in the real world and apply those concepts and that kind of framework to women's issues specifically, I think is going to be necessary in order to attract women to the movement.
Okay. And I wanted to move on from there actually to, I guess, more major party discussion, but in the wake of the Virginia gubernatorial elections this year, it was kind of made out that there is a hard split, and this might be something that has been going on for a while and people are just noticing it, but there's a hard split in the partisan tendencies of married versus unmarried women. In general, unmarried women go as heavily for the Democratic Party as any other kind of identity group, while married women tend to lean Republican. They're not a very solid Republican bloc, but Ken Cuccinelli, who had a social issues agenda that was largely attacked by feminists for being anti-woman, won married women by, I think, 10 percentage points, while Terry McAuliffe won unmarried women by, I think, 40 percentage points, something like that. So I wanted to get your perspective on how political movements appeal to women in general, and if the differences in what women are interested in, depending on their marital status, is large enough to justify different kind of appeal strategies.
Yeah, I mean, the split in how people vote is greater between married and unmarried women than it is between men and women, and that's been true for kind of a while. I think that definitely, Ken Cuccinelli and his Attorney General's social agenda and Republicans like him is very legitimately frightening to women. I think someone who floats legislation that would require transvaginal ultrasounds, it's not just about the ultrasounds, I mean, it is about that, obviously, but it's also about, first of all, the mindset that gets you to a place where you think that that's okay. And then second, where else is that going to take you? Like, what else? If you're okay with using the state to physically violate my person, when does that end? And so I think if the GOP is ever going to appeal to single women who are concerned with their bodily autonomy, then we're going to have to, at the very least, stop that kind of thing. And it's not just single women. I think single women are also maybe more concerned with the rights of, for example, gays. Ken Cuccinelli created an entire website to defend his sodomy ban, and we've seen throughout history, and then not very long ago at all in Louisiana, that these sodomy laws are used by police officers to justify harassing gay people. And I think that single women kind of look at that social agenda, and they look at these small government GOP candidates having no problem using the government to enforce a pretty backward social agenda, and they're disgusted and frightened, and that's going to have to be dealt with. And it's going to have to be dealt with because not only are single women a pretty consistent voting bloc, but they're growing as a percentage of the population. So if the GOP is going to rely on married women to keep winning elections, as marriage is being foregone and delayed more and more, that's not going to be a winning strategy going forward.
That's definitely true, is that the single women are a large and growing demographic portion of the population. But I wanted to focus on, so like you said, you found Ken Cuccinelli's platform to be frightening to women. What explains that he could win, the married woman vote?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I don't know. I think it has to do more with economic, not certainty or comfortability, but just less. I think married women feel and statistically are less economically precarious. I think that they feel a little more insulated from kind of the possible abuses of the state. Another interesting thing, and I don't know if Ken Cuccinelli is guilty of this particularly, but a lot of people on the right, I mean, I experienced it when I, sat on a panel about women's issues. really vilify single mothers, really hardcore. They criticize them and they blame them for society's downfall, and all the criminals were raised by single mothers, and there's just a lot of blame heaped on single mothers who are single women. And again, as a percentage of the population, they're growing. I believe more babies are born out of wedlock than within now. So again, if the right has this, reputation of vilifying instead of helping women, then that's going to be problematic.
Well, so here's something I wanted to run past you. Some kind of reformish-minded conservative commentators and writers and politicians have been pushing that the kind of answer for the Republican Party as far as reforming itself is making itself more politically appealable to middle-class families. So, for example, Senator Mike Lee came out with a large economic agenda that focused on middle-income family income security. Things like an expanded child tax credit, expanded child care credits, things of that nature. And obviously, as the Republican Party, apparently, even in the case of someone who might have an anti-woman agenda like Ken Cuccinelli, can appeal to married women, and possibly, obviously, married women who are also mothers. I didn't look at the dive there, but I assume that the married woman population crosses pretty heavily over with the mother population, at least married women who have children. It would be interesting to see married childless women, how they split down. But kind of this strain of conservatism says that reinforcing the family unit, and not necessarily the heterosexual family unit, but just the family unit in general, is the way forward for Republicans, and encouraging people to get married more and start families more and have a family as an economic unit will solve some of these demographic problems for Republicans. Do you find any cachet in that at all?
I definitely will say that the data certainly bears out that there's a lot of utility to a family, that marriage has benefits, that children do best when they're their two biological parents are married to each other. That's it's data, it's unassailable. Whether that's going to be a winning strategy for the GOP to try to promote that, I think one complicating factor is that the GOP traditionally has had a pretty narrow definition of marriage, or a pretty narrow picture of what marriage should be. And demographically, that's just going to be a real hard sell, because men are not earning what they used to, and women are earning more than they ever have. And so this idea that's peddled by the right, that women should stay home and be caretakers and men should go out and earn, that's going to be really difficult, because there's no longer a situation where uneducated men are able to provide for a family, and men are not getting educated like women are. So I think if the GOP could maybe reimagine marriage as the woman earns and the man stays home, that might work, and that certainly has benefits. Whether a man is going to provide enough value, and that's kind of what we're seeing at the lower levels of the income stratosphere, is that marriage is not declining, it's only being delayed for people with bachelor's degrees and who earn good money. But among the poorly educated and lower income people, they're not getting married. Women are getting pregnant and not marrying the fathers, because the fathers are in prison or not financially able to contribute. So telling a low-income woman to marry her baby daddy when he's not able to provide for her financially, and actually maybe a drain, I think is a losing strategy in every way, shape, and form. I don't think it's going to win voters. I don't think it's going to win hearts and minds. I don't think it's going to convince that woman to get married. And so I think demographics are going to require a reimagining of marriage as an institution.
That's certainly possible. Something that might mitigate that problem, that, like you said, I mean, let's grant that the Republican Party probably has more traditional views of gender roles than the Democratic Party. Just very generally, let's grant that. There was a proposal. I don't remember who it was. I don't think it was in Senator Lee's economic plan to give a fairly generous tax credit to the second earner of a two-earner household, which to me would maybe mitigate some of that, to say that, we're okay with two-earner households, we're okay with women working, we in fact want to encourage the development of the family as an economic unit, and maybe that would play in with what you said at the beginning of this kind of immigration reform, minimum wage reform, and giving people lower on the income ladder the flexibility to both go out and have careers and have the ability to take care of their children at the same time. So that, obviously we see that raising a child is a huge time investment and money investment. But giving people at the lower end of the income ladder the flexibility to raise a family, put in the time, and still have a two full-time earner household might be some kind of fusionist, feminist, libertarian, conservative strategy here?
I think definitely focusing on making, I wouldn't go with maybe a tax credit, but right now two earner households are penalized. So a lot of people are not getting married because that's actually going to be problematic for their taxes. So, not penalizing two earner households is where I would begin. And then, looking for cooperative, small government ways to, if not incentivize, at least remove some of the barriers to women's success and to two earner households, or to one earner households. If you have a poorly educated man and he's willing and able to stay home, that may make more sense.
I don't think it's so. Obviously, the marriage tax penalty is a thing that's discussed. I doubt that it's discouraging people from getting married. Probably the most likely effect is that when two people get married, one of the earners, and probably likely the woman, will either cut back on her hours, take a lower paying job, more of a part-time type thing, rather than actually discouraging getting married. But what that does is kind of discourage economic development in general, where you have people cutting back on the amount of work they're doing, the amount they're producing in order to raise children. And that's probably something that would be more mitigated here.
Right, I think that would be great. I think that, again, if you have to earn a lot of money to make up for the tax penalty and the cost of childcare and the cost of domestic help, if all that requires, your first job to be extremely lucrative, well, you're not ever going to get started, really. You're going to work part-time, or you're not going to work at all.
Yeah. All right. I think that's everything that we've got for today. Thanks a lot for joining me, Cathy. You can go check out her blog at sexinthestate.com. It's very fascinating. And I will see all of you next time on Blogging Heads.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.